dramastorians aren't necessarily people who write mainstream conventional narratives, but they disrupt the normal order of things in the kind of homogenous field of storytelling. And so the definition I settled upon eventually was that a dramastorian is a writer who seeks to disrupt conventional representations in theatre by excavating and dramatizing marginalized or forgotten lives. And I feel like it really articulates what I try to do.
Hello and welcome to Collected, the podcast about writing from the Royal Literary Fund. I'm Juliet Gilkes Romero, a stage and screenwriter, and with me today is Satinder Chohan, a fellow writer. Satinder's first play, Zameen, told the story of a struggling Punjabi cotton farming family in rapidly globalising India. Subsequent dramas include Kabaddi, 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 about sport, nationality and belonging. Satinder's awards and nominations include a 2025 Tinniswood nomination for Southall Uprising, 2 Off West End award nominations for Made in India, and 5 Off West End nominations, including Best New Play for Lotus Beauty. Satinder and I will be chatting about her life, and we'll be taking a deep dive into the Royal Literary Fund archive, featuring a huge range of fellow creatives discussing in depth what it means to be a writer. So it's November, and this month is very special because it's Diwali. Satinder, how do you celebrate this festival of light, and what influence does it have on your creative writing?
Oh, Diwali. Well, Diwali is my favourite festival of the year, and we celebrate it in a huge way in Southall. If you come to Southall during Diwali, it's spectacular. There are just fireworks exploding everywhere. So I do a trip to the temple, to the Gurdwara during the day, where there are very long lines, and it's incredibly, incredibly busy and crammed with people just coming to pay respects and to have langar. Langar is like the free kitchen that we have in the Sikh religion. So the food is delicious. And then we also make food at home. My mum makes diva lamps out of flour and water. So she makes these cotton wicks, and we use mustard oil to light it all up. And then we have fireworks. We have fireworks in the garden. And every house in Southall just has a fireworks display. So you have neighbours kind of having fireworks display competitions with each other. So it's an incredible event. And it has a huge influence on my writing. I think things like that, cultural events like that happen in my hometown, they have a massive influence on the stories that I write. Southall has a huge influence. It inspires me to tell the stories that I tell, infuses much of my work. I think it's because, it's an immigrant working class town, and it's almost like the power of storytelling unearths the kind of hidden stories of the communities that live there. And I always see it as a kind of a personal service to the community to be a writer. In Sikhism, we have this notion of seva, which is selfless service. So when I write, I feel like there's a greater purpose than just my own sort of personal writerly objectives, and it's very much about excavating and preserving and unearthing the stories of our town and our communities.
What was teenage Satinder like growing up in Southall?
Oh, she was a bookworm. She was a bookworm and a tennis fanatic. And I think that covers all bases. Actually, tennis and football fanatic. But I used to play a lot of tennis, whereas I never played football. I spent a lot of time at my grandfather's house in Southall. And on one end of his street, there was a cemetery. And on the other end, there was a library. So I feel like, we covered the extremes of like death and then life. Like books to me were life-giving. I'm solitary by nature, so I was always quite reclusive, and I would escape to the library and just read books. And Sikhs aren't, we're not particularly literary as a community, which is ironic considering we worship a holy book that is perceived as a living guru. So, for me, the library was just an incredibly, incredibly special place. And that's where, I used to dream of being a novelist and, of writing books. So I really immersed myself in reading and writing and playing tennis. If I hadn't been a writer, obviously I wanted to be a professional tennis player. So
I would love to have seen that.
I know, me too. But it was unfortunate because during all my matches, the girls were so much bigger and taller than me, and they always used to lob me, and it was always very, very easy to beat me in a tennis match. So, yeah.
So you realised when you were quite young that you wanted to be a writer?
Yeah, I did. I loved writing. I loved words, and I just loved the power of words, I think. And I wrote epic long stories. Whenever we were set a story task at school, other students would write, 2 or 3 pages. I'd write like 20. And that's a habit I still haven't kicked as an adult, is my overwriting. So, there was just something about escaping into different worlds and tapping into the power of imagination. Yeah, I knew from a really, really early age, but it took me a long time to actually try to write professionally, because I think growing up, even though I knew that was what I wanted to do, it wasn't a clear path to actually writing. And it took me a while to build up the confidence to actually think about writing creatively.
Yeah, those pathways are not always really obvious, but certainly I think lived experience really helps us, and you've spoken really evocatively of what Southall is like and what it's like to grow up there. We're going to take a little dive into our archive, and we're going to hear from playwright Rhiannon Tice on what inspired her about her London experience.
Growing up in London had a massive influence on my writing. From the brilliant, vibrant part of North London, where the streets would fill with red and white clad football supporters singing their hearts out, to dilapidated King's Cross, the busy chaos of Camden, Islington and Upper Street, where I'd get the bus every morning to primary school. Everywhere was just a little bit rough round the edges. I remember vividly as a child visiting my mum's friends who lived on Ladbroke Grove, where the houses seemed to go on forever. My early plays were all set in London. It was what I knew. London fascinated me. Who were these city dwellers? What was their life story? My first play, about 2 outsiders connected by the same woman, was set on Holloway Road. My second, The Silent Time, was set predominantly in a flat above a shop on Green Lanes, a stone's throw from my childhood house. My third play was Dogship Park, our affectionate name for Clissold Park, now gentrified, but when I was little, you had to avoid the dog poo and the flashers. And so it went on, the city as a backdrop to so much of my work. But then, when I moved, the scope of my work grew and the city became more generic. It didn't have to be set in a square mile of North London. My first play for radio was, in my mind, set in Clissold Park, but it could have been any park in any town or city that has a travelling fairground. There are certain places, smells, sounds and faces that I will always associate with London. The roar of a home goal on match days, that euphoric sound of voices celebrating together, the stench of smoke on the upper deck of a routemaster, fraying material on the lumpy seats in the old tube carriages, and the rickety clatter as they would speed through the darkened tunnels, mothers waiting with bulging bags of shopping at the bus stop outside McDonald's on Seven Sisters Road, sirens speeding down Green Lanes. I haven't lived in London for over 10 years, but I still have a close affection for my little patch of North London. I know it like the back of my hand, each paving stone, each letterbox. But so much has changed now. The stadium I knew so well is now flats. The park I lived opposite has had a complete makeover. Would I recognise it if I ever returned? No matter. It lives on in my memories, and occasionally these memories find their way into whatever I'm writing. Little details and nuances that I write almost subconsciously take me by surprise and always make me smile. Like coming across an old forgotten photograph from years ago you thought was lost forever.
Is your writing rooted in Southall, or are you more concerned with the diaspora, South Asian diaspora?
I think both. I think my writing to borrow a word, is very global. It's local and it's global. So it is rooted in the local community, but at the same time, because that community is so global in its nature, it's inevitable that some of the stories that I tell will also reach into the diaspora. And if it is a local story, it's inevitable that it reaches back to Punjab or it reaches back to India and vice versa in a way. Because it's a really special place. When I was growing up, there was predominantly an Indian and Pakistani community. Whereas as I grew older, you had successive waves of different communities coming in, Somali, Afghan, Sri Lankan, Nepalese, different Eastern European too. And so for me, Southall, even though it's my hometown, is very much a place of the world in the sense that global events, harrowing global events that have happened outside, war or upheavals in other nations have sent some of those communities to us. So there have been waves of refugees and asylum seekers. So in a way, I love that the world has come to us as a place of refuge as well, and everyone sort of exists there in a spirit of solidarity, because that's what that community is very much about. So yeah, it's a local community, but it's very much a sort of globalized community in that regard as well.
I've seen several of your plays.
Thank you, Juliet.
The last one, I think, was made in India at Soho Theatre.
That's right. Yeah.
What brought you to that subject? It was about pregnancy, surrogacy.
I remember reading an article about an English woman who had gone to an Indian fertility clinic and basically hired a surrogate to be her vessel. And I remember that was the word that she used. And I was so horrified by the idea of this Indian village woman being the vessel for this English woman. It felt to me immediately like there was a play and a drama there, because there was such a conflict of kind of politics and economics and emotions that were involved in that dynamic between the two women. And also there had been a couple of sort of altruistic egg donations within the community as well that I had known about. And it was odd to me that suddenly this was taking on a kind of more commercialized footing, that it was becoming sort of financially transactional, whereas before it was one woman offering her eggs to another woman out of the goodness of her heart because, the other woman was infertile. So suddenly it was this... I think it was an opportunity for me to look at surrogacy and neoliberalism, the everything for sale kind of world that we live in. And it was very much about the marketization of women's bodies and women's emotions. And, as a feminist and someone whose work is incredibly woman-centered, felt like there was so much that I could explore and say about the world that we live in through the metaphor of surrogacy, of commercial surrogacy. I felt like I had to write that particular play. And also thinking about the Indian village woman, I thought if my parents hadn't taken the paths that they had taken to the UK, that woman could have been me, or it could have been any number of relatives who are still in India. So I felt like I really connected to the Indian village woman's experience too. And my work is very much about exploring that kind of hidden, I hate to use the word underclass, but in the sense that they are invisible, they are a hidden class, global class. So I try to write stories about their lives' experiences and their struggles, so that we have a greater sense of what they have to experience and endure, rather than just seeing them as vessels and vehicles for cheaper, efficient, faster products, whether it's a pair of trainers or a baby.
The breadth of your work is very interesting, because I think the first play that I saw of yours was about sport. Kabaddi, Kabaddi, Kabaddi. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I'm an absolute sports fanatic. So my life is actually scheduled around football and tennis.
I remember.
So any opportunity to write about sport. And in a similar way, I decided to use kabaddi, which is an ancient, sort of like an ancient wrestling sport, but it's more akin to like bulldog, I guess, English bulldog. But it's a rural Punjabi sport, and it's very dramatic, and it's all about the breath. So it's about holding the breath. I mean, I can't go into specific rules because it can get a bit technical, but when you're moving on the kabaddi field, it's about holding your breath and saying kabaddi, 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 as many times while you're making your moves. So it's about breath and it's about physicality. And again, I thought it would be a really fantastic metaphor. There were two acts that were two halves of the kabaddi game. So in the first act, I had stumbled upon this really interesting piece of information that kabaddi had been a demonstration Olympic sport at Berlin, the Berlin Olympics in 1936. And, Hitler had, I can't remember who was in attendance, but there were definitely National Socialists in attendance, the Nazis. And it was a demonstration sport, but it was incredibly popular. And so I think they did one demonstration, they did a second one, they did a third one. And it had been a team that had gone out from India to Berlin. And I just tried to imagine, my God, what must that have been like for somebody to have left Punjab or, left India, to have gone on this trip to Berlin. And especially at a time when India was still colonized, so there was the politics of the situation as well that played into it. So the first half was set in 1936, colonial India and Berlin. And then the second half were basically these characters sort of reincarnated as kabaddi players in 2012 London. So that was the mirror. It was the 2012 Olympics. But they were construction workers who were helping to, build the stadium here. And they were illegal immigrants. So it's about the illegal immigrant experience, modern day illegal immigrant experience. But the idea was that, they had traveled into a different lifetime. And so it was the connection and politics between that. But kabaddi was very much the metaphor that held that piece together.
Yeah, it was a very powerful piece and very well received. And I remember when I met you and then completely being drawn into your imagination and lived experience. And that's what storytelling's about, What drives and inspires your writing?
I did come up with a word which I felt really articulated the kind of writing that I do. And I did look for the word elsewhere. I think there was I was like, is it actually a word? But this word dramastorian just suddenly popped into my head one day, completely randomly. Okay?
That's great.
Completely randomly. So I'm going to explain it because it made a lot of sense to me in that I sort of broke it down. Obviously, there's a touch of historian in that word as well. Dramastorian, historian. And there was something about a dramastorian sort of excavating these stories, telling these stories, preserving these stories, and then trying to create a creative legacy from these stories. It feels like that's the process around it. But actually the word storian, so I was breaking it down, and the word storian comes from an Old English word meaning to stir, to move, to disturb, even to destroy. I think the noun is also stir, which means stir, bustle, agitation, contention. And so for me, these words were so evocative because it felt like there was a sense of disruption from storian, sense of disruption and a sense of stirring things up. And so I felt like being a dramastorian has an element of being a sort of cultural or creative disruptor. Dramastorians aren't necessarily people who write mainstream conventional narratives, but they disrupt the normal order of things in the kind of homogenous field of storytelling. And so the definition I settled upon eventually was that a dramastorian is a writer who seeks to disrupt conventional representations in theatre by excavating and dramatizing marginalized or forgotten lives. And I feel like it really articulates what I try to do with my work.
I think it does. I think it really does. I love the word, and I think it should be introduced into English literature now. But, I mean, the way to kind of platform it is to write about it, perhaps, and explain why this is your approach.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that thing of just the stirring, the stirring and the agitating. Because I write the stories I write, obviously, my sort of dramatic path has been quite tough in terms of the stories that are told and the stories theatres or whoever might put on. I think our stories are so vital, and it's so important that we tell them before they are lost or disappear. And we need to be supported as writers telling those stories, because otherwise, theatre writing or fiction writing, all forms of writing will become this homogenized and very privileged zone. We can't let that happen, which is why I think it's really important we dig into our communities and we tell these stories and we represent these communities and we tell and we try to convey something of their experiences and their struggles.
And I guess we have to be creatively resilient to be able to tell these stories in the way that you have framed them.
Yeah, and I think resilience is a big part of it.
Yeah.
And I think it comes back to your original sort of question of, what drives the writing. And I think that is the big drive. I think it's not just about us as individual writers. I don't think it's about ego. I don't think it's about awards. I don't think it's about fame or whatever. I think it's actually how can we best serve those communities? How can we best serve as writers in the context of the industries that we work in? They're not the most welcoming and accommodating places for the stories that we want to tell. So I think resilience is that underrated quality that we all really have to rely on to keep writing those stories sort of regardless.
I would agree with that. I think that takes us very nicely to another of our authors, Paul Dowswell, and we're going to hear him discussing the books that he's always wanted to write.
Writing fiction for a living is like walking a tightrope between what you're interested in and want to write about and what your publisher will want to bring to the market. This is an entirely reasonable situation. The sooner an aspiring writer realises you have to write something that a publisher thinks they can sell, the more likely it is they'll be published. I've written 12 historical fiction novels now, but I've found it difficult to interest a publisher in areas away from the standard world wars from a Western perspective, Tudors and Romans. There's plenty to be interested in there, but sometimes my interests lie outside these confines. So what this piece is about is the book I really want to write. I'm fascinated by 20th century Russia, and would argue that it's a vital area of history for us in the West to understand. But we are mostly ignorant of Russia and its history. A few years back, I wrote a novel about the teenage son of one of Stalin's secretaries, and what it was like living in Moscow in the months before and after the Nazi invasion of 1941. The book was published in 2014 under the title Red Shadow. I knew I was in trouble when I gave my first book talk to promote it, on this occasion at a big city grammar school. I started the talk by asking the kids who Stalin was. They all stared at their feet, and eventually one brave soul put his hand up. "Hitler's wife," he said. The really interesting thing was, he didn't think he was being funny, and nobody laughed either. They just didn't know. Everyone knows about Hitler and the Nazis, even primary school children, and quite right too. But why Stalin is such a mystery, not least because he arguably rivals Hitler in wickedness, I'm at a loss to explain. So when my editor rejected my idea for a sequel to Red Shadow, a long-cherished desire to write about the Battle of Stalingrad, I completely understood. It does sadden me, though. I really feel people need to know more about Russia's contribution to the Second World War. Thanks to Saving Private Ryan, we all know Omaha Beach on D-Day was a bloodbath. And most secondary history students know the first day of the Battle of the Somme in 1916 was a massacre. Perhaps 2,000 Americans died on Omaha Beach, and around 20,000 British and Empire soldiers died on the first day of the Somme. But in Russia, during the 4 years of the war against Nazi Germany, They lost on average 17,000 soldiers and civilians every single day. My bottom drawer is full of book ideas that no one wants to publish, from the Chinese Opium Wars to escaping from Devil's Island. And that's where they're staying. But I do think it's a shame we have so little interest in our Russian allies in the Second World War, and I would like to be able to write a novel about the Battle of Stalingrad one day. It turned the tide against the most evil regime the world has ever witnessed.
I find that so achingly authentic as an experience of a writer. You know, my bottom drawer is full of stuff that I never know whether it will make it to the stage or to a TV screen. And I think perhaps we're both similar in the way that we do like to excavate untold stories in the past. And it makes me think of a quote by Toni Morrison, and she says, "Struggling through the work is extremely important, more important to me than publishing it." How do you feel about that?
I think that probably sums me up. I don't think we choose the stories we tell. I feel like we're compelled to tell the stories we tell. And sometimes there isn't a choice in that. And it can't be about, am I going to get this on, or is this going to be picked up, or, do you know, you have an idea and you follow it through. And I feel like so many of my stories have been conceived in that way. And so I understand what's being said in the audio, but I feel like I don't really think about what is the commercial potential of this project. I've just never really thought. It's probably why I'm like, you know, doing the small projects I am. But that's what sets us apart as writers as well. I think there are some writers who are very sort of conscious of the commercial sort of viability of their work. I think that's also one of the reasons why I've worked a lot with Asian theatres, because I think there is a shared understanding of what the importance of those stories are. And I'm so grateful to those theatres and the people who have allowed me to create that work. It's when we move outside of that circle that it gets harder and more difficult. You know, and that is talking about more mainstream creative avenues. It is harder to make that work because there is not that shared understanding about the importance of it. So, you know, as well as kind of immigration and globalization, colonialism is another one of the big issues that I like to write about. Again, because, you know, it's about my ancestral past, our collective ancestral past as, you know, a community. And again, there's that cultural amnesia around empire. We all know that it exists. It exists on the stage, on the page, in society, in British society. The dark side of empire is not talked about enough. And when we were growing up, it was very much about, you know, glorious empire. And oh my God, all the fantastic things that, you know, empire did. Whereas we knew within our families and our communities that there was a completely different narrative that was happening. We grew up with stories about colonialism in Punjab and, you know, atrocities that were committed. I mean, the Amritsar massacre, which wasn't even commonly known when I was a child, but we were taught about it in our families. You know, that was the kind of oral history that was being passed down. So the discrepancy growing up and going through school and just not learning or knowing this history was huge. And that massively influenced my storytelling as well, because there is that omission of that history that needs to be told. We need to understand that as a nation. We need to have a better understanding of it, because if we did, that would have a knock-on effect in our understanding of immigration. We are here for a reason. We didn't just turn up, you know. We didn't just appear and take jobs and all the rest of it. So I think about actually, what is the story saying? What is this story? What is the value of this story? Of course, I want the story to be universal and I want it to reach as many people as possible. But it's also, what is the story that I can tell that other people maybe can't tell, and what can I say about the world and the past and history and what has gone before and what is happening now. And then the hope that you can find your creative tribe. You can find a home for that story. I think that's what I always hold out for, is that I'm telling the story that I really want to tell, that I feel I need to tell. And then at some point along the line, I will find the right home for it. I might not, but that's okay. I love the idea of collaboration as well. How do you universalize that story so that it reaches as wide an audience as possible? But you need to be in that space to be able to have those conversations. So if you're not in that mainstream space having those conversations, you don't ever learn how to package that work for a bigger audience. So it's a problematic process because our work is seen as risky and marginal. It's not seen as a commercial venture that is going to bring audiences in. And I think that's wrong. Made in India sold out in so many theatres on that tour. Like on the ground, Lotus Beauty it sold out at Hampstead. Our experiences tell a different story.
So now we're going to our technical slot. Writing requires a lot of focus and discipline and solitude. I know that I'm speaking for an increasing amount of writers, including myself, who are struggling with this. How do you find a balance with your creative writing and being a caregiver and looking after elderly parents?
Very tough. It's incredibly tough to balance all those responsibilities. My mother was diagnosed with a mild cognitive disorder a few years ago, which we are pretty sure has progressed to dementia and requires care, sort of constant care. I'm very reluctant to leave her on her own these days. I don't think it's something that can be done. I live between my parents' place and my sister's place. That's one of the sacrifices one makes as a writer as well. Whatever works for you. And so when I am at my parents', which is a lot of the time, it's very difficult because I work from home, it's really difficult to keep momentum on writing projects when I'm constantly thinking about my mother as well. She might be downstairs, I might be upstairs, but it's also making sure that she's okay, that she's engaged, that I might come downstairs and put on, so there's like a live link to prayer from the Golden Temple in Amritsar, which she listens to every morning. So it's making sure that that's kind of set up for her for a little bit. And it's this mothering role, it's really akin to that. I don't have children, but I did help to bring up my brother's kids in the same house. So I feel like I have a very good sense of what parental responsibilities were, and now that's being sort of transferred to my parents. My father's pretty self-sufficient, but he's also in his 80s, so I think it's a full-time job for him to take care of himself. And so with my mother, it's just very difficult, and I think it's that thing of just constantly checking, and then the disruption that ensues, because once I get into a writing zone, I want to stay in my writing zone. And it's very hard when you come out of it. And then sometimes she might be in a temperamental mood that particular day. You've got to live by the moods as well. And that makes the writing incredibly difficult. She's got more volatile over time. There have been some violent episodes recently that have been emotionally exhausting. I think it takes it out of you, and especially when you're juggling so many writing projects at a time, which is emotionally exhausting in itself because you're switching gears, you're switching from one project to another. It might be from radio to theatre to fiction to film, whatever it might be. Those are the gear changes which require emotional energy, and then dealing with that on top of it as well. I think it's a lot. Yeah, I confess I'm struggling with that, and I'm still trying to find the balance of how that works.
It's so important for writers to look after themselves. I mean, do you have a self-care routine given these circumstances?
I do. I try to, we're lucky that we have sort of the Grand Union Canal running at the back of, it's very close to us. So I go for very long walks, very long runs, decompress. So I'm very conscious about my own care, but I think sometimes it's very difficult not to be drawn into certain experiences. So, there were a couple of nights where my mother was, she also has severe arthritis. So she was up for 2 nights we had to go with her to get a steroid injection, and then she was up for another night. So there are sleepless nights that you're dealing with as well. You just don't know what's going to, manifest at any given moment. Sometimes you get so drawn into it that it's tough to take care of yourself, but I think it's those in-between moments between the episodes that suddenly spontaneously arise. That's when you have to take care of yourself. I took her for an MRI scan on Friday, and I didn't realize I had been managing my work. I'd had a set of deadlines for a while, and I thought I was doing really well. I thought I was doing really, I was managing the work and I was with her, and we went to get her MRI scan done. And we got a little bit late because we were lost. We couldn't find the place. And so she was quite anxious by the time she arrived at the MRI place. And then she said she was going to the bathroom and I was filling out a form. And then we heard a scream, and my mother had fallen on the toilet and basically had urinated everywhere, all over the floor, all over her clothes, everywhere. She hadn't even made it to the MRI scan. But that day just absolutely pushed me over the edge. And so for the whole weekend, I have just been, it's kind of a come down from that. It's sort of the emotional energy it takes, and you don't know what your triggers are going to be when something is too much. And it's the accumulation of those. And then it's having to deal with those moments and sort of regain some kind of equilibrium and calm after incidents like that. And it's not her fault. It's absolutely not her fault. You recognize that. But then sometimes it might be about lack of other family support, whatever it might be, and it just pushes you over. And you still have to deal with deadlines. You still have, so I still had work to do. But it was so hard to focus. And in the end, it was I have to just get up. I have to just bring myself back to a calm place. So there's a lot of meditation. There's a lot of yoga. There is, running, exercise. I take meandering walks. Sometimes if I leave the house, I will take advantage and I will go for a very, very long meandering walk until I'm ready to go back. So I think it's trying to find those pockets and openings away from the work where you just kind of come back to yourself.
You care very much for your parents. How have they helped form your creative drive growing up with them?
One of the things I always remember about my mother when I'm caring for her is, she was born in the 1940s, and girls in that time were never sent to school. They never learned to read, and her parents actually, they never sent her to school. But what she did was she was so determined to read and write that she ended up, she would go and see the local holy men and basically read scriptures with them. And that's how she learned to read and write. And her uncles tried to forbid her from doing that. And that's when her father did stand up for her and say, my daughter's doing that, it's up to my daughter. But the rest of the family were really so anti her actually learning to read and write. So, so for me, it's such a privilege to be able to tell stories, because that's what my mother was determined to do. And I don't forget that. And as a teenager as well, she had 9 siblings, and 7 of them passed away by the time she was 15 or 16. She saw each of them pass away. And you think about times like that, and that's what I remember every time I'm caring for her, and the lives that they led and what brought them here and what they've given me and what they've given all of us. So I think that really shapes me creatively and really drives the stories that I tell. My father, on the other hand, he was much more of a kind of oral storyteller. So he liked to tell stories when I was young. He'd come to my school and tell the kids. The kids would get really excited, and he used to do these. He used to come to to my middle school, and tell stories about the Sikh gurus, because those were the only stories he knew. But, they'd all sit around. It'd be like reading time. And he would come and tell those stories to them. And, the kids would be beaming and be like, Mr. Chohan, uncle, get really, really excited. And I think there was something in that as well. He gave me a different kind of creative inspiration. And they were never sort of you have to be a doctor, you have to be a lawyer or any of that. They were very supportive of my choices. Although I don't think, my mother doesn't really fully understand what I do. Even sort of pre-dementia, she never really understood. So they're not really connected to my work in that way. Although they came to see Zameen, and my dad was moved to tears during Zameen because it was something that really touched him deeply. And that meant a lot to me, that it was something that he really understood and connected to, having been a farmer in Punjab himself. So yeah, they've given a lot. And, I think it's like all our ancestors. If we choose to remember them, we remember the power of what they have given us and the gifts that they have given us for us to be here in such a privileged position to be able to tell stories.
Satinder, thank you so much for joining us. And now we go to Anne Morgan with the latest RLF news.
Geographical anomalies, a nightmarish wind farm, and 1820s Australia are among the topics featuring in new publications by Royal Literary Fund Fellows this month. Vitaly Vitaliev's Atlas of Geographical Curiosities, Britain, published by Jongleurs Publishing, celebrates some of the UK's more unusual features, including the hotel room that became Yugoslavian for a day, the territory that still follows the Julian calendar, and Britain's Great Barrier Reef. Meanwhile, in fiction, Catherine Clement's novella Turbine 34, part of Wild Hunt Books' Northern Weird project, follows an environmental scientist evaluating a controversial wind farm on the lonely West Yorkshire moors. Looking beyond the UK, Catherine Quarmby's novel The Low Road is now out in paperback from iBooks. Shortlisted for the 2025 New Angle Prize, it tells the true story of a young woman from Norfolk who was transported to Australia in the 19th century. A Royal Literary Fund Fellow has been recognised at the Black British Theatre Awards. Playwright, presenter, scriptwriter and children's author Trish Cook received the award for book and lyrics in celebration of her body of work. The award was presented at London's Piccadilly Theatre on Sunday the 26th of October. For more information, visit blackbritishtheatreawards.com. 2 Royal Literary Fund Fellows are offering an online masterclass on writing historical fiction this week. The 90-minute Zoom session will see Emma Darwin discuss the inspiration behind her new book, The Bruegel Boy, and what it took to write a novel set in 16th century Holland with Sanjida O'Connell. The 2 authors will offer advice on how to weave research and imagination into unforgettable stories, including a Q&A and a take-home handout with tips and practical exercises. The session will run on Wednesday the 26th of November from 7 p.m. You can buy your ticket on luma.com. 2 Royal Literary Fund Fellows have been shortlisted for the 2025 T.S. Eliot Prize, awarded annually to the writer of the best new poetry collection published in the UK. Gillian Allnutt's Load explores constraint and freedom, protection and danger, and brings the full force of history to bear upon the words she weighs. Meanwhile, Nick Mahoka's The New Carthaginians was a Guardian Book of the Year. The winner will be announced in January 2026. And finally, 3 Royal Literary Fund Fellows will be bringing festive cheer to Liverpool Central Library this December. Pauline Rowe, Sophie Duffy and David Swan will be giving a Christmas poetry reading at the library on William Brown Street from 6 to 7 p.m. on Friday the 5th of December. The event is free and you can register to attend on eventbrite.co.uk. And now, back to the studio.
Satinder, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been wonderful hearing about your family, your creative journey, and why you write and why it's so important. Thank you very much.
You've been listening to Collected, the podcast about writing from the Royal Literary Fund. If you'd like to share any comments or questions, please use the hashtag RLFCollected on our social media channels. The music was composed by Andy Glenn. There was research by Nicola Baldwin and post-production by James Robertson. Our producer was Anne Morgan.